Welcome to this episode of The View from Here, filmed on April 4th, 2019. This year we're not on a regular schedule because of my health problems. Basically, when I find something of special significance, I ask the wonderful crew at Cheshire TV to schedule a filming session, and they always say yes. Today we show an interview with a medical doctor who provides clear data from the CDC on the measles situation and these data contradict the dire pronouncements we are getting from the media on that measles situation, including the Keene Sentinel, which is supposedly independent, and I wish they were more independent and not so easily just follow the main media trends without questioning them. As usual, we have some great music to end the program. The Concordia Choir and Orchestra, with more than 100 persons, performs Mozart's Ave Verum. It's a real treat. It could be that because I'm doing some ad-libbing too, and that's very dangerous in my case, that we run out of time, and then I'll bring you that music sometime in the future, because I think I'll still be back, although I'm not at all sure I'll be here next winter, and I don't mind. I have bladder cancer, so but do what we can when we can do it. Folks, we need to keep our eyes and minds open on many complicated issues. Ask yourself, do I really know all the relevant issues, all the relevant facts? Do I know which person or corporation profits from presenting an issue with a slant on it? The mass media seldom give you an objective, fair overview. A recent glaring example that has nothing to do with vaccines is the highly biased presentation of what is happening in Venezuela. Please look into that. What you're getting is a very slanted view. Well, yes, as your mother told you, truth matters, and it is damned hard to find these days. So, here I am going to do some ad-libbing. It's always dangerous, but I asked myself this morning, what the heck am I doing here? It's not that easy to be where I am. I'm quarters through my 91st year, and things are not getting easier. I can promise all of you who are getting older that. So, am I Paul Revere riding into the country to wake up the population? It would be a nice picture to think of. Or am I just like Don Quixote on his horse, riding out and attacking windmills? Well, you take your choice and see where you want to put me. Anyway, I am upset about the Keene Sentinel's editorial on vaccines 2 days ago for several reasons. Basically, by falling into line with the main line, Keene Sentinel is helping to build walls. And wall building has a problem that has existed through my whole life. And I believe that's what I want to talk about, why it's building a wall. I think most of us are aware vaguely that we as human beings, we have a task somehow to find out that we're all human beings who can live together on this earth and work things out and make it possible. But there are people who profit from wall building, because as long as you can keep people divided and fighting each other, you can get your larger purposes accomplished. And they are usually behind wall building. In the past, after World War II, there was this feeling that maybe the world is getting somewhere with the United Nations. But then the Cold War came in. If you look into it back now, that Cold War profited the military-industrial complex, and people like JFK, who talked to Khrushchev and was able to solve the problem that could have blown the world to pieces in the early 60s, were obviously not wanted and somehow were eclipsed from there. But the point is that the Cold War, which led to the Vietnam War, all of that behind there is part of this wall building business. And we are having all kind of other issues where wall building has profited certain interests that are behind it that like to have people fight each other. So, all right. Now, in vaccines, today's data that I offer you are a counterdote to the scary, dangerous situation that the Sentinel describes, where some people who do not vaccinate their kids become a danger to humanity. That's not jump so easily to conclusions. Actually, the way that those people I talked about in the Sentinel's editorial is a very, it's just a lot of nonsense. Well, it happens to be, we have a very large holistic community in this area, which is aware that there are question marks around vaccines, about some more than others. They are not necessarily opposed to vaccines. To call everybody an anti-vaccine activist just because they raise questions is not helpful. So with this, let's go to the side camera now, because it is an illustration of questions being raised about vaccines and vaccination that are worth considering. This is Vaccines, Autoimmunity, and the Changing Nature of Childhood Illness by Thomas Cowan, MD. And the reason why this book is so interesting is that what we have here is, this is a very new book. I've just started reading it. It came out at the end of 2018, just behind us. Anyone in the holistic community here should read it and get it. It's a very in-depth consideration of where we are with vaccines, immunity and autoimmunity, and how that plays its role in the changing nature of childhood illness. Thomas Cowan was a practicing medical doctor, family physician in this area. And I think this is a perfect example of a book that should be widely discussed in this area. It should have a review in the Sentinel. It should have a discussion in the Cheshire Medical Center, where there are a lot of wonderful people who actually have confided to me, both MDs and nurses, that they have a lot of questions about vaccines. But because of the prevailing nature of the medical, industrial, pharmaceutical complex, it's very hard these days to admit that you have questions. I suggest to the, I think, advanced human community in the Monadnock area to take up this discussion in depth and not just on the measles flap, which you will see after today's program is orchestrated to accomplish certain purposes of which ultimately the pharmaceutical companies are the big benefits. Let's leave that there for the moment and let's go to this review. This book, by the way, just one more footnote, is highly recommended by several medical doctors and by a senior research scientist at MIT. So, now, here are things that are omitted by, I need to watch my time here, okay, that are omitted by the one-sided establishment which steers the discussion on vaccines. What is totally left out is that at the CDC is a senior scientist, Dr. Thompson, who a few years ago came out saying there was a cover-up of the results of an MMR, measles, mumps, rubella vaccine, and autism study, and that they destroyed the results of this study, which clearly showed a connection between those two. The fact that this doctor asks to be subpoenaed by Congress and that Congress hasn't acted on it shows that Congress is not doing its job. And we should ask Annie Kuster to do her job. Why? If this man is wrong at the CDC, well, then let's prove that. But if he is right, maybe the CDC should get a very hard look at whether they are doing their job the way they were asked to do it. All right. And then the second thing that should be raised is the fact that, well, we have talked about it, that just labeling everyone who raises question anti-vaccine person isn't helping. So this is a talk. I'm interested in not building walls. We need a dialogue. Let's get a dialogue on vaccines started in this area, because we have a marvelous human community here that is capable of handling it. And maybe we'll be ahead of the rest of the country, but let's do it, folks. Let's do it. And for now, we're going to be ready to hear the data that you should see that show that there is no reason to be concerned about measles outbreaks in this country. Oh, God, help us all, measles outbreaks. Let's go to the video.
You know, I think back in our history lessons in school and the famous story when Paul Revere raced to the streets screaming, "The redcoats are coming, the redcoats are coming." And I wonder if the new battle cry we will all have to scream as we run through the streets is, "The lab coats are coming, the lab coats are coming." What's happening in this world? What am I talking about? I'm talking about measles mania. Take a look.
Growing measles outbreak prompting a state of emergency in Washington state.
A state of emergency has been declared in Washington state, where 35 cases of the infection have now been confirmed.
Now, a dozen schools, a Costco, and Portland's airport join a growing list of locations exposed to measles, which can be fatal.
Cases also reported around Portland, Oregon, an area considered an anti-vaccination hotspot.
An area considered one of the nation's anti-vaccination hotspots is battling a growing measles outbreak.
If someone brought in measles, even one person brought it into the international airport, and they encounter unvaccinated kids, it starts to spread like wildfire.
People have such strong feelings about this. It's one thing to protect your own freedoms, it's another to infringe on other people's health. Right?
Yeah, and the science is very clear on this, that vaccines are safe.
Well, there you have it. 35 people in Washington have made international news. They're like a rock band skyrocketing to the top. This is better than Milli Vanilli after winning an award for best song. I guess I'm dating myself there. But these 35 people somehow are making it onto every news station in the world for having gotten what I thought was a trivial childhood illness. But before we get into that story, I want to talk about measles really quickly. You know, we sort of brush over this, and so I want to get to the medical facts around measles. And to do that, I'm bringing in world-renowned pediatrician Bob Sears to join me. Bob, I know you're at your office right now, and you got someone coming in just a few minutes, but can we go over what measles is to begin with? What is measles? How dangerous is it?
Well, yeah, measles is actually a benign childhood illness for almost everyone who catches it. 99.9% of cases are ultimately harmless. And you go back several decades, people actually used to think of measles like we think of chickenpox today. It's just something that everyone catches, and you go through it and you get your lifetime immunity. So it's only serious for an extreme minority of cases.
So so what are the actual numbers? Because I keep, honestly, I've been listening to these reports all week. It's been crazy. And I'll hear people say, some will say it's 1 to 2 per 1,000 will die, or 2 to 4, per 1,000 will die. I mean, first of all, to say like 1 to 2 or 2 to 4 is such a massively different number. I mean, 1 in 1,000 and 1 in 500, which is essentially saying 1 or 2. So the way they just loosely throw these numbers around, like increasing the risk just in that term 1 or 2 by hundreds of percentage points. What is the actual number? Because I'm always saying, we've been talking about 1 in 500,000 would die in America, as I remember, from the measles in 1960 before the vaccine ever arose. But from a clinical perspective, as a, you've looked in this, you're a pediatrician, what is the death risk of measles?
Right. So the media do inflate the death risk of measles in order to scare people. They honestly do. Where the 1 in 500 or 1 in 1,000 fatality rate comes from, that comes from the outbreak we had in 1989 through 1991. Out of all the children who came into the hospital or were sick enough to see a doctor, out of just that data set of children, about 1 in 500 died. But we know historically, previous to that, going back 4 or 5 decades, 90% of measles cases were so mild, people just stayed home. They knew it was a harmless childhood disease, and they're familiar with it, so they just stayed at home. They didn't even ever tell their doctor. There's only about 10% of people who got sick enough to seek medical care. So that's the data set they use to calculate today's fatality rate. But if you included all children who catch measles, when it goes around an entire population, the fatality rate honestly is only about 1 in every 10,000 children who catch it. And then the number 1 in 500,000, Del, that comes from, if you consider measles going through a whole population of adults and children, in which some adults do catch it. If you consider the entire US population back in the 50s and 60s, the measles fatality rate was only about 1 in 500,000 Americans. But those numbers don't scare people. And the media, I'm sorry, if you don't believe this, but they do this all the time. They have to use the worst number they can get a hold of in order to scare people.
So they're just taking the extreme cases, they're taking that group of extreme cases that ended up in a hospital, and amongst those extreme cases, they can say 1 in 500 will die. So they're cooking the books, essentially.
Correct.
And, I was thinking about the number because I was looking. I did my investigation into this too because I really want to know. I mean, here on the High Wire, I want to make sure that we're medically accurate. Nothing I'm saying is conjecture. We base all of the things that we discuss here on published science. You know what struck me that I never thought about before is that measles was then, the death rate of measles was 1 in 10,000 children back in 1960 before we ever had a vaccine. And we think this vaccine was so great. But that's exactly the same number that we were describing autism at that same time. We were also saying, back in the 60s, 70s, even early 80s, the assumption was that autism was about 1 in 10,000, which really meant we don't know what it is. It's such a small number, it's almost non-existent, but we kind of just say 1 in 10,000 have autism. And not that, I'm going to do a show to link these two, but we're still at 1 in 10,000 who are getting, who would die of the measles, but our autism rate has skyrocketed to, I like to use the New Jersey number of 1 in 32 children. I think if we were accurately, listing all the children with autism the way they're doing New Jersey, they're a little bit more precise about it. So we're at 1 in 32, but I'll go ahead and give you the CDC's numbers at like 1 in 36 or 1 in 45. Those are terrifying numbers. I mean, that's a terrifying climb from 1 in 10,000. So when people say to me, this great vaccine, and then you look at the hundreds of thousands of parents around the world that are blaming that very vaccine for the regression into autism. I mean, these things, and whether or not, no matter how you look at it, isn't it shocking that we're screaming with our hair on fire about like 30 people in Washington who, by the way, all chose to get the measles? I think they're perfectly happy getting the measles, just like I would in my family. I would love it if my kids would get the measles, so they'll have lifelong immunity. They'll be able to rush in to any place that's having a measles outbreak and help out. Whereas people that have only been vaccinated, they have to be terrified, right? So I just think the numbers.
Right. Yeah, I think it's interesting that Washington is declaring a state of emergency over 35 cases of measles, when in the entire United States, no children have died of measles, in the last, 15 years. The last childhood fatality we had was in 2003. So, but what fatalities we have had is we've had fatalities from the actual measles vaccine. The CDC collects data on severe reactions to all vaccines, and they've actually received 449 reports of fatal reactions to the MMR vaccine. And in the last 15 years, there have been over 100 of these fatal reactions to the MMR vaccine, with 0 fatalities in children from the measles disease. And where's the state of emergency of that? I feel like the CDC, I mean, I imagine they're sitting there with these data on their desk, and they see this pile of 100 or 450 people having fatal reactions to the measles vaccine. And then they have just on this other side, in the last 16 years, 1 child dying of measles disease. What do they do with those data? Why are they just sitting on that? If there's a state of emergency, I'd say we need to try to figure out why more people are having fatal reactions to a vaccine than they are from the very disease that the vaccine is trying to prevent.
Right, and you're talking about deaths, and we're not even talking about all of the adverse reactions and autoimmune diseases that are coming, from the vaccine that are reported too into the thousands. But so I want to ask you this. I read somewhere, and I couldn't find it exactly, but the World Health Organization, we've said that we've eradicated measles, and I remember seeing that there's actually a threshold of the amount of cases in a country that can occur and still consider it eradicated. They're trying to say that there's this rise in measles because of the unvaccinated community.
Right.
But really, the unvaccinated community is sort of for the most part, has a stasis from the moment the smallpox vaccine came in. People have been against vaccinating, and ever since then, it doesn't change a lot. But my question is this: is 30 cases, or even in the case of Disneyland, which I think was somewhere in the 130 to 160 range, isn't that an acceptable amount to still say that even in a fully vaccinated population, you're going to see these cycles through the years?
Right. Well, Del, when there is a media agenda, and when big medicine and big pharma are trying to get everyone to comply with a medical agenda, you have to have fear. You have to scare people into being compliant. So you have to tell them, number one, measles is dangerous and it's going to kill everybody, and that's not true. Number two, you have to say measles was gone and now it's coming back and it's on the rise. Because if it's not on the rise, then there's no fear. And the reality is, as you just said, if you look at the measles numbers over the last 10 years or so, you'll see measles is not on the rise. It's cyclical. We had a high year about 5 years ago of about 600 cases. Then we've had a few low years. 2 years ago, we had about 300 and some cases. Last year, we were low again. And this year we're starting off, kind of relatively average. So measles is definitely not on the rise. And Del, it's also important to realize that measles was never eradicated. People like to claim, and again, this speaks to the fear. They always say measles was eradicated in the year 2000 and now it's coming back. They don't tell you in the year 2000 we had 86 cases. And that's because, as you said, the CDC declares something eradicated when it's no longer continuously spreading around the country. Measles is actually still considered eradicated in our country because it doesn't spread. It's not on the rise. We just have cyclical outbreaks. And so again, people, need to maybe respect measles, but there's absolutely no reason to panic.
One of the things that, I think about is we never talk about, what these news programs never do? They never go back and look at that community and say, what happened to those 35 people? Once the panic is over and, a week or two later, when they've all gotten over the measles, we all just move on and we try to pass laws, which I'm going to get into in a minute. But we never go back to the community and say, how are those people doing? And you know what we never do? We never thank them. I actually think it's time to start thanking these communities because they truly are the only ones that have herd immunity now in their community. Those 35 people, measles will never infect them. They will never carry it again. And one of the things that I think we have to start talking about is the baby boomers is the last generation of true herd immunity that exists in this nation and really in the world. What happens when they die off in this large population, the biggest, generation of our time who all have natural lifelong immunity? What's going to happen to this idea of herd immunity when the people who really had herd immunity die off?
Some unintended consequences when we try to eradicate a routine childhood illness so that this entire generation gets vaccinated, but the vaccine wears off after 10 to 15 years. So all the adults and all the elderly who were vaccinated and never caught measles, they're going to be completely susceptible. They're going to have no immunity. These moms are growing up, and they're during pregnancy they'll have no immunity. They're giving birth to babies who have no immunity. So now our entire population of United States babies have no measles immunity. And so we're creating these susceptible age groups where measles can be more serious. Of course, it's more serious if you catch it as a baby. It's more serious if you catch it as an adult, as an elderly person. Yeah, we're only protecting the kind of the herd of children who get the vaccine at age 1 and age 5. They're not catching measles anymore, but that's actually the age where the disease is the safest to catch. So it's kind of interesting that we have these consequences of mass vaccination that people don't really take into account when they consider, I think, a population as a whole. And again, I'm not saying that people should or shouldn't get this vaccine. I just think people need to understand all the information, not give in to the fear. And I wish the media would sit here and just give us objective facts and just tell us the entire truth about measles and the vaccine instead of cherry picking in order to incite fear. Because you see it on every single news show. They're not sitting up there objectively like reporters were initially designed to be. They all have an agenda these days, and people need to start asking, why is there a media agenda behind all this?
Well, there you have it. That's why we're here. That's why you're here. Bob, thanks for joining us and giving us some of the facts around measles. I really appreciate it. And
Sure,
I know
Del.
that you're putting your neck out on the line to simply as a doctor state the facts. I appreciate that you're doing that. You have courage. You're being bold. You're being brave. Keep it up, all right?
All right, thanks.
All right, take care, Bob.
Well, I was afraid of this, and it happened. My ad-libbing now canceled the music for today. I'm sorry about that. But I think it was an important program. I hope that there are people in this community who are carrying forward the idea of a dialogue and not wall building about this issue of vaccines. And if you have any comments, send them in to this view at CheshireTV.org, and we will mention your comments if you would like at a future program. I think I'll be back on this topic. And thank you for tuning in today, and we hope to see you next time.